Good evening. I'm Michael Kirsty. I'm the Executive Director of Friends of Chamber Music of Troy, New York. On behalf of Friends of Chamber Music, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's Performance in Context conversation with Master Bowmaker Sue Lipkins. Sue Lipkins is a highly respected bowmaker who specializes in bass bows. Her handcrafted, made-to-order bows now have a waiting list of 10 years as she completes 10 bows in 1 year. Susan's expertise earned her a gold medal at the Violin Society of America's 2012 competition, the first and so far only woman to be so honored. Although she studied bass, she gravitated toward bow making and apprenticed under some of the best bow makers in the world. She takes particular pride in addressing the concerns of the musicians who will use her bows. Her clients are in a wide range of celebrated orchestras, including the Philadelphia Orchestra, the Houston Symphony, and the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, among many others. Throughout this conversation this evening, if there are any questions or you'd like to hear more about a certain topic, please write it in the Q&A chat below, Q&A or chat below, and I'll try to work it into the conversation. There will also be designated time at the end for questions from our audience. Sue, thank you for joining us this evening.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. It's very nice to be here.
So you are a Juilliard-trained bassist turned bow maker. How did that happen?
Well, I went to Juilliard. I have a bachelor's and a master's in bass performance. But at the end, I don't like auditions. That was my downfall in getting a career in music. And so I got a job after school at Padelson's music store. And I got promoted and promoted. I was working upstairs and ordering music and all that kind of stuff. But I got offered a job at a bowmaker shop, and I actually had taken the New York City temporary license test to become a licensed a temporary teacher, and I was going to go into teaching in New York City, but I got offered the job at Williams Salco as a salesperson, and I just said, well, I thought you can always teach. Job will always be there, but working for a bowmaker is very exciting. And if he would teach me how to make bows after hours, I would take the job. So he said yes. So I started learning how to make a bow after hours. And in 6 months, uh, Andy Schmidt, who was on the workbench, he quit to go to dental school. So I asked whether I could have Andy's job. And they said, if you can learn how to rehair bows over the summer, you can have Andy's job. So, because they knew I was a good fit personality wise in the shop. And I guess I showed a little bit of promise in bow making. So I learned how to rehair. I was paid to learn how to rehair bows. I'm the luckiest girl in the world. And so I'm very grateful. That's how I got my start in bow making. I was always a little bit of a bow crazy person. I always was fascinated by bows. Being in Juilliard, if anybody had a really good bow, I always liked to try it and look at it. So there was that aspect already in my makeup. And I just love bow making. And for me, it's a better fit because when you're done making a bow, you have an object in front of you. You can see it. It'll be around for a long time. In music, you play, and unless it's being recorded, it's over. It's in the minds of the audience and the musicians, but that's it. It's over.
Right.
So I prefer the object to see it.
Oh, that is amazing. So could you tell us a little bit about how a bow works? How does it pull the sound out of a string? Maybe share the anatomy of a bow?
Right. So, and I have one here. The bow, it has, most people know it has horsehair. So, this is the horsehair, and it's the horse tail comes from a male horse because they pee forward so the urine doesn't get on the hair. And I know it's disgusting, but these are things you think about. And it comes from China. Um, and so I'm actually a little concerned about tariffs from China. How much is the horsehair going to be now? I don't know. That's an interesting thing. And so the rest of the bow, this is made out of ebony with mother of pearl eyes and a mother of pearl slide here. This bow, and so this, it's called the frog. Nobody knows why. We just don't know. Why is it called the frog? We don't know. It's called the frog. And this one particular is mounted in 18 karat pink gold. This is this bow I made to get a second gold medal at the VSA competition. So I have two, but I don't have three. When you get three, then you're something called hors concours, which means, like you graduated, you can't compete anymore. Oh, wow. So maybe one day or maybe not. This is the winding. This particular winding is made from silk thread and gold wrapped silk. So, and this is the grip, the leather grip. The stick is made of Pernambuco wood, which is a Brazilian hardwood, and it's already on the endangered species list, and that's a whole thing which we're not sure if it will become more endangered or whether it will still be rating 2, which is that you can still make a bow from this. So we're not sure what's going to happen next. But this is called the ivory tip, but right now, it's actually Mastodon. And right now, Mastodon is even banned from New York State. You can't do anything with Mastodon. So now, currently, when I make a bow, I use something called tip armor, which is a linen polymer composite. You can actually see the linen weave, and there's no way you can mistake it for ivory or Mastodon. And it's totally ecologically good. Mm-hmm. And then this part here is called the button, and it's made of, like gold or silver and ebony core. It has a little dot of mother of pearl on the end, and it can tighten and loosen the frog, which tightens and loosens the hair. So that's the bow. And those are the parts. How does it make a sound? Well, if you were to, so you have to put rosin on the hair, and rosin is from the pitch of a tree. It's sorry, and the rosin is sticky, and it sticks to the string a little bit, and there are little barbs on the horsehair that keep the rosin, catch it in place, and over time the friction heats up the rosin onto the hair, and then it stays there, and then the rosin grips the string, and you can make a sound. The bow, if you saw, has a curve, and the curve is called the camber. It's very important when you are making a bow. You start with a raw piece of wood that you rough out, and to over dimension of the finished product. And then you have to add curve. So how you add the camber determines part of how the bow is going to play. You can have more camber, less camber, and it all has to be very even, the camber. If there's a flat spot or a kink in it, then the bow doesn't play very well. So
That was a thank you, Susan. And that was a beautiful bow, by the way.
thank you. Thank you.
And so you focus on bass bows, which are a bit different from the other bows of the string family. What
Right.
special considerations do you take when designing a bass bow versus another bow?
Okay. So I've only made bass bows in my career, except for I made one violin bow and two cello bows. So I really consider the bass bow what what do I what does the customer want? What do I want to make? And the differences between the violin, viola, cello, and bass bows are the violin bow weighs the least. The average is 60 grams, and it is the longest.
Mm.
So that you have length and um, the least weight. So it's the thinnest. And viola bows are a little bit shorter and a little bit heavier. The average viola bow is around 70 grams. And for cello, the average weight is 80 grams, and it's even shorter. But the bass bow is shortest. So, but it's the thickest and the stiffest.
Oh, okay. Have you ever had a bassist request a longer bass bow, or is that something you
Yes, yes, I have. And
what
that's a tough consideration. The longer the bow, the heavier the head feels. So I, I've, I've had. So then you have to consider how are you going to balance that on the other side to make it feel well balanced when it's longer. Um, so I've made some longer French bass bow. There are two kinds of bass bows, right? French bow has the frog that you saw. A German bow plays underhand like this, and it's a very high frog, very tall, and it's much longer than the French bow, and the head is lower because of the length. So, in order to, the German bow was developed, and in order to make it balanced, the head is much lower intrinsically for the German bass bow to make it balanced. And then I've had a special order from the principal bass in the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra. He is a huge man, 6'7", and he wanted a long German bow. So I made one, and it didn't work out. So I'm due to make another one soon. I'll get it right this time, I think. It's hard. But what I do love is working with the musician in a back and forth and trying to please them. What do they want? Usually it works out the first time. If it doesn't work out the first time, I'll try again. So we'll hope for the best.
Right. When working with a certain client on a bow commission, some people refer, I want a strong bow or a flexible bow. Can you
Okay.
tell us a little bit more about what they're really talking about?
Well, I try and determine strong, like what is their weight that they're looking for, because if you want a very strong bow on a lot of levels, then that means it's going to be thicker. The thinner the graduations, the more flexible the bow becomes. But there's also the camber. There's the more camber, the stiffer it feels. But there's a point where the camber goes the opposite. So you can have a full camber, but if you go even further, sometimes the bow feels floppy there where you've gone too far. So it's really, you have to experience these things and, sort of learn, learn on the job. Um, so I try to please, and then lately I've been asking the customer to make a little video of themselves playing for me, so I can see their technique and I can hear their bass, even onto the little, iPhone, whatever, but it still works, and I can try and match the wood to their base and try and um, try and figure out how much camber they want and what to make for them. We have a big discussion about it.
So the camber is that arch that we see in the bow, right?
Right,
It doesn't start that way. You have to kind of bring it in that direction, correct?
right, right,
Right.
right.
Can you tell us a bit more about the camber process?
So the it depends on the wood. You generally try and follow the grain. So sometimes the grain of the wood is curved in a really nice way already. You always add some, but that's the most ideal. It's like, oh, it's already curved. This is a good one. But the way you add camber is to heat the bow over a heat source. I use a hot plate that gets from Sears from a long time ago that had no safety, like shut off or anything, and it gets really hot. Um, in the days, say like in the 1800s, they would use a charcoal brazier. That's what they used to heat the stick, a little charcoal pot in the workshop inside. Oh man. But that is radiant heat. So my idea is that the electrical version, which is the hot plate, is still radiant heat. And I think that helps. Other people use an alcohol lamp, which is adds heat in a different manner, and they use that. That's good for them. I didn't have good luck with that method, but I have good luck with the hot plate.
So once you have that radiated heat onto the stick, do you push it around yourself, or do you
Oh
work?
no, so I have a form that I have on top of my workbench, and when you can feel, you have to twirl the bow over the hot plate, to heat it up evenly. Not you don't want to burn the stick. And when I can feel the heat radiating back out, it's already gone into the core of the wood and it's radiating back out. That's when it's hot enough to bend. If you're impatient and you don't wait for that heat to be radiating back out, you could break the stick. So it's a little heartbreaking when that happens. And sometimes the grain has something funky in it and it breaks, or yeah, it's frustrating sometimes, but you know, that's what happens.
So, what factors do you think contribute to a bow's price? Why are some more expensive than others? Do these represent a different in terms of craftsmanship or materials, or
Right.
what changes it?
So there's the antique factor,
Mm.
right? So what makes a Strad more expensive? That well, there's partly the antique factor, partly the great sound. So there are certain bows that are really coveted by musicians. In violin, viola, cello, Francois Xavier Tort is, I think, the most expensive bow you can buy. He was the originator of the modern bow, and he lived in Paris in the mid 1700s. Although I can't remember when he died, maybe 1792. Sounds right. I don't know. Don't quote me. But anyway, his bows are highly sought after and they're worth a lot of money. There's no more of them, right? So he made a finite amount, and that's all there is. So and he's got amazing. They sound great. They have great workmanship, and they're there's nothing like it. So that's one thing. In bass bows, Sartori, Vigneron, those are highly sought after bass bows. Bouchard, old French bass bows. And so those are more expensive. I think playing the bow over a number of years helps the sound. The same like in an instrument. When you have a brand new instrument, many times people say, oh, it just needs to be played. And playing it strongly somehow affects the molecular structure of the wood in a way that makes it sound better. And I think that happens on the bow as well. And so maybe there's that antique factor of it's already been played in is part of the sound that the bow gets. There are many modern makers who are so great at what they do, and they're making amazing bows. This is like a golden age of bow making right now for modern bows. And I have so many colleagues who I highly respect. Gorgeous workmanship. The bows play great. It's a really great time on that score. For if you're a player, great time to choose a bow.
Great. And how many bows does a player typically need? Is there a
Okay,
difference in a
well,
bow for practice or a bow for chamber music or an orchestral bow or?
right. All of the above. Some many musicians who are just starting out, they don't have the money to buy two or three bows. Um, so they would want something an all-around bow, and that's hard to do. I mean, it's really nice to have, say, a lighter bow that plays off the string really easily. Um, and that bow could be your chamber music and solo bow, or and your Mozart bow. Like you're gonna play light music, and then you can have a real heavy bow that's stiffer, that plays Bruckner and Brahms, and that's you're gonna play out and really be heard in the orchestra. So two maybe would be great, and the sky's the limit if you have the money. I have customers who have my bows, but they also have antique bows, and they have, you know, different bows for different things. And you can get into a collector mode and just have tons of fun with bows.
Mhm. I want to backtrack. You mentioned, the French bass bow versus the German bass bow. Which
Right.
which one came first, or which one, is has been.
Concurrently, they were invented concurrently. Uh, it wasn't like you had a cell phone and you could, record a concert and play it back to your buddy if you were in France and they're in Germany. No, it was, you know, uh, sort of hazardous traveling. There were musicians in the time. Mozart, for instance, traveled to Paris from Austria, and it was a little hazardous. He got sick. His father got sick. His sister got sick. On the road doesn't sound pleasant. And in my reading of the book L'Arche that I've been reading recently, they said that Mozart never knew um, about the modern bow. What he was experiencing in German, he might have seen a close to modern bow, but no cigar. They're called the Kramer model in Mannheim. But he was in Austria, and he didn't. Even though he traveled to Paris, the modern bow had not been invented yet. Then he went back to Austria, and he never saw one. Is what they think. So meanwhile, in Germany, in bass playing, the underhanded bow was being perfected, and at the same time, in the mid 1800s, the French bass bow was also being perfected in France. So two different styles, two different countries, and even now, in the say like the Berlin Philharmonic, I don't think there's one French bow player who's playing there. So there's still some, for a bass, obviously, and in the Berlin Philharmonic, they prefer a 5-string bass over a bass with an extension, which is what we have in this country. Most players play with an extension. So things develop differently geographically.
Right. So, the upkeep and maintenance of a bow is a vital part of bow ownership. What should musicians know about maintaining their bows? Are there common mistakes that they make that you see?
Yes. So you need a rehair, probably more often than you think. If the if the hair feels like the rosin wears out very quickly, you know, then you need a rehair, even if you didn't break any of the hairs. If you break a lot of hairs, you shouldn't keep playing on the bow before you get a rehair because you'll start to hit the stick, and that's not good. And then you can
Unpleasant
wear out
sound,
the stick.
right?
What?
And also an unpleasant sound.
True, true. Right. And if you want to wipe down the stick from the rosin after each time you play, you could do that with like a rag. But there's not that much maintenance to be done. So you shouldn't clean the hair, you shouldn't clean the stick. Let that to the professionals rehair the bow. Just get it done maybe a little more often. So I always say, like, once a year, whether you think you need it or not, because the horsehair is organic material and it can break down over with sunlight or being exposed to the air. So it's not at its best. So after a year, I used to rehair Midori's bow when she was just starting out. I was working in Manhattan, and it was every 2 weeks. She would come in every 2 weeks, and there would be no hair left. None. It would be just like little smitherings, like she was just breaking all. So, you know, you can go 2 weeks, or my longest somebody has ever gone in between rehairs is 18 years.
Whoa.
I don't think they were playing that much.
Oh my gosh.
So, because I write the date inside the bow when I rehair it on the underneath of the pearl slide. So I know, I know.
No. Um, does the bow always maintain its straightness or curves, or do you see that change?
It could change um, depending on the conditions that it's stored in. So if it's in very hot weather, say like in a bass trunk stuck somewhere, or it could heat the stick to the point where it maybe just straightens a little or gets crooked, or so there's that. Or over time, say somebody doesn't loosen the hair all the way, over time it could lose camber. But there's always, you can add more, you can straighten the bow. It's a little dangerous because every time you heat the stick, there's a little bit of danger involved. But in general, it's fixable.
Okay. Um, and you also mentioned rehairing the bow. Can you
Yes.
explain the process of rehairing?
Well, you take out the old hair, and you have to make plugs that fit in a mortise that's in the head and a mortise in the frog. And you use, um, I use acrylic thread to hold the horsehair in place. And then I have powdered rosin and I melt it and I make sure that the knot is stationary. And then you put that in. There are two schools of rehairing, either from the head to the frog or the frog to the head. I am of head to the frog school. And no, nothing else is as good, in my opinion. So, and there are definitely finessing aspects, of rehairing. You should have an even ribbon of hair, and uh, there is a you can heat the hair up a little bit. So you wet the hair to make it a nice even ribbon. I comb it with a special comb and make it a nice even ribbon. And then I turn the hair with a special stick to simulate how it would be in the frog. And then make a knot and do the same rosin treatment and then put it in the frog. And on the outside of the frog is something called a ferrule, which holds the hair in a wide spread. And you use a wedge, a little wooden wedge, to hold it in place. So that's the basics. It takes a lot to actually learn how to rehair. There are many little steps, both in rehairing and then many little steps in making a bow that take skill. Um, and a lot of people don't have the patience to learn.
So you finish 10 bows a year. How long? So
Maybe a little less now, maybe a little less. Yeah. But anyway, yeah.
what's the average work time, for these bows?
Well, yeah. Um, some days, like, life happens, right? So you have to go to the DMV or something, and I don't get much bow making done. But I'm trying to make headway on my list, so I'm doing a lot less rehairs now, in order to devote myself more to making bows. Um, I just like it's a After my mother died in 22, I just thought, what do I want to do with my life? What do I want to spend my time doing? Does it rehairing or is it making? And I decided making. I'd much rather make a bow than rehair a bow. So
Amazing.
that's, yeah.
You produce amazing work. Um,
Thank you.
so you work with these amazing orchestras and these musicians in their bass sections. How do you incorporate their feedback into your work? Are you on the call with them? Do you Zoom? Do they come to your show?
Oh,
Or
yeah. So I have a big discussion when they get on my waiting list. I have a discussion. What bass are they playing? What kind of music do they play? What do they want in a bow? And by the time I get to them on my list, their needs could have changed, their bass could have changed, but okay. So we have a very serious discussion about what they want in a bow from me and what bows they currently have and what is lacking in those bows so I can get an idea. Plus, Pernambuco has 5 subspecies in there, and they each have different sort of sound properties. So over time, I've learned which, like what kind of wood sounds good on what kind of bass. So I try and match that up. And there are certain things that are non negotiable, like Pernambuco in general is very heavy. It sinks in water. It is heavier than, you know, the gravity, it won't float in water. So that's a non-negotiable. Like that I have to have. And then, um, what was my point? I don't know, but ay,
they're
I had a thread. It's gone.
no worries. Do they once they reach their spot on your wait list?
Right.
That's kind of when these discussions begin. Are these usually in person, over the phone? Do they come to your shop and try out some prototypes, or?
Sometimes. So, say like the principal bass of the Houston Symphony came to the he came to the workshop, like, I don't know, 4 or 5 years before I made his bow. He tried out a bunch of bows, and at the time, I I had a Vigneron bass bow here that was owned by a friend of mine in the San Francisco Symphony, and he sent it to me for some work. And so the bass player from Houston tried it, fell in love with it, said, "Make me this," or something like this. And I tried really hard. And then he loves my bow. And it just so happened that my friend retired from the San Francisco Symphony and asked me to sell the Vigneron. And I called him up and he was like, "Yeah, that sounds great." So that was exciting. He fell in love with it a few years before I tried to make something similar, and he got the original too. So that's a great thing. So not everybody can come here, and I have made a lot of bows for people in Europe and Asia. They can't come here, so we do like a FaceTime or a Zoom chat or something so we can talk face to face. I like that. And then I'll also, like I mentioned, I like to ask them nowadays to just make a small video of themselves playing the bass so I can really see what is their playing style. What do I think would help their bass, to make it sound better. So all these things with experience, I've been making bows on my own since 1985. With the experience of that, I found that I can hopefully pretty much tell what to make.
Amazing. We do have a question here from one of our audience members. What material do you recommend for the black ebony layer under the tip armor? Thank you.
Ebony. So I have an ebony, special ebony that's wide enough and just the perfect thickness. It's pre-made. It's ebony also.
And ebony is also a very dense wood. Is it
Right.
denser
It
than
also sinks in water. Yeah.
also does?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Um, and sorry, one other question. Is Pernambuco wood difficult to acquire?
Yeah. It's almost impossible right now. So uh, it's on the endangered species list. But if it's in this country already, you can buy it. But it is illegal to buy it from any place outside of the United States. So we don't grow it here. Whatever was imported before the ban, you can buy.
Mhm.
But it's a problem for new bow makers. It
Mhm.
really is a problem. You have to really want to do it.
Now, I read about heartwood. Is that the part of the Pernambuco that you use? Can you tell us a
Yes.
bit more about that?
Well, there's sapwood, which is more of the outside, and this is the heartwood that we use. That's, yeah. The sapwood is wood that's close to the bark.
Mhm.
It's right underneath the bark, and it's white, so you can't miss it. Pernambuco is like a dark reddish orange, and so you can kind of tell what's the heartwood by that.
Mhm.
And it was used in the ballasts of ships that were coming from, say, India to Europe, and as weight to weight down the bottom of the ship. And it became known to the bow makers like, oh, this wood is really good for bows, good for sound. If you were to tap on it when it was like a bow blank, just a thick piece, it would sound like a crystal goblet. And that wood and that sound goes through, it is a really integral part of the sound. So we have now Some bows are made from carbon fiber, and while they do produce a loud sound, it's one dimensional. So that
Mhm.
is it. You can't make colors, you can't shift the vibe of what the bow is doing, but you can when it's Pernambuco. It's very evident you can do that.
And looking at the broader context of bow making, how do you see the future of this craft evolving? Are there things seem to remain largely the same as they were, but are there any new developments on the horizon that you see?
Some bow makers experiment with different head shapes or with different, like the frog will be like a lattice work of silver or gold, and there's no ebony, or the head will be like a very just sort of blunt silver something or other. I'm not so fond of that, but I mean, it's very modern looking, and I don't know. Maybe that's a future. I really don't know. It's harder and harder for somebody to become a bow maker because the wood situation. I mean, even alternative woods like ipe, that could be on the endangered species list soon. So all of this, you know, I'm pro ecology. I mean, if that's what it needs to be, that's what has to happen. We'll have to find alternatives, but I doubt seriously whether any of the alternatives would be as good as Pernambuco.
Mhm.
So that's a sad thing. Um, but I have an apprentice who is just really so driven to make bows, like just completely driven, and so you got to respect it. And he managed to find. Well, actually, I found it for him. I got a call from a bass player uh, in New York City. Hey, my friend, he's got Alzheimer's. He was doing baseball making for a few years. He was a bass player. He has some wood that his son is trying to sell. Are you interested? And I said, well, no, but my apprentice is interested. And he was able to buy this wood, and now he has a big stash of Pernambuco for himself that was imported into this country in the 1980s. So totally legal, you know, and so there is Pernambuco in this country, but it's scarce.
Mhm. Mhm.
So you have to really want it.
Right. All right. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to add them into the chat. Um, we'll continue on here. Um, right. So, aside from determination, what advice would you give to young bow makers or aspiring artisans in general?
Well, love what you do, right? So I love what I do, so I'm very committed to bow making and committed to the musicians. I learned so much from the musicians, from working with them, what works for them, what doesn't, and I'm always learning. So I don't know. I made a bow for the bass player in the Australian Chamber Orchestra, Maxime Bibot, and he loved the bow, but then like 3 years later, he was like, I just wish it had a little more camber here. What do you think? So I'm coming in from Australia. Can I come to your shop and you do it right then? Oh my God. The pressure is on, right? So we worked for like 3 hours on the camber. I put a little in, he would play it. We'd have to cool off first, then he would play it and be like, okay, that's good. Can we get a little more? It was 3 hours of torture, but in the end, I learned a lot. And then a few years later, he was like, Sue, I just think it's a little too stiff. I want it thinner. I was like, oh, this guy, I can't please him. I don't know. Okay. But so I got the bow back and I made it thinner. And he just, at first he said to me, is it okay if I have the local guy just shave a little off towards the head? I'm like, no, it's not okay. Send it to me. And I took a bunch off and he was happy. And then they played in Albany. The Australian Chamber Orchestra was there this summer. And he was like, Sue, just one little place behind the head, I think. And I was like, okay. So he came to the shop. I looked at the bow and I could see a little bump, a little bump. I took the bump out and he was happy. I learned so much from this encounter. You know,
Amazing.
so important to try and please the customer. They know they're the player. I do know how to play. I went to Juilliard. I can play the bow. I know certain things of how it works. But somebody like Maxime Bibot is such a particular player, so exacting. You can learn a lot. So, about young bow makers, you have to really want to do it. A good way to get started is to learn how to rehair. So as a bow maker, you'll always have to know how to rehair your own bows. So if you can't learn how to rehair, the career in bow making is not going to happen. So you can learn how to rehair, and rehairing is, if you do it well, you can always work. You can always have a job. So that's something to think about.
We have another question here. Have you ever worked alongside a luthier to make an instrument bow pair specifically for one person?
Well, my husband is a luthier. So a couple of times, it just so happens that he made a bass and the customer who bought that bass also owns one of my bows. Um, the first time it happened, we were dating and his name is David Wiebe. He was living in Nebraska at the time, and he made a uh, a bass for a customer in Kansas City who was coming to Nebraska to pick it up. And I I made a bow for a guy in the Philadelphia Orchestra, and he ended up sending it back. He wanted a heavier bow after all. So I sent that bow to David and said, I can't come to Nebraska to try your bass, but my bow will be there. And David had been having trouble setting up the bass. He had a bass bow, but nothing sounded right. And when my bow arrived, the bass sounded great. So he was so happy. And then the customer who came to pick up his bass, he gave a little recital, and in the encore he played my bow, and the people at the audience said, "You've got to get that bow. The bass sounds so much better with that bow."
Oh my God.
So he ended up taking it with him, and he ended up buying the bow. So that was one story. And then this last summer, David made a bass, which ended up in the Philadelphia Orchestra. But I was making a bow at the same time for a customer in LA who ended up, so I was play my bow that I was graduating and finishing the camber and all that stuff on David's new bass. He made it not for a specific person, just out of love for the bass. So I made that bow I don't know, it really sounded good on that bass. So the guy in LA ended up not taking that bow. I know this is a long story. Sorry, I'll try and make it shorter. Anyway,
No.
I gave it to the customer in the Philadelphia Orchestra to try. Maybe he would be interested, and he loved the bow and he bought it. And then guess what? He bought the bass too.
Oh,
So it was
amazing.
very expensive rehair. He came for a rehair. Anyway,
That is great. We
yeah.
have a few more questions coming in here. When a hair breaks, should it be clipped on either end?
Yes. Yeah. Right. Because
Oh,
otherwise it'll just be flopping around. And if you get if you pull it out, then you could mess up the knot inside in the mortise. So clipping is a good idea.
and a couple more. Do you stain the bow?
No,
No.
no, not at all. You can if the bow is not a gorgeous color in the you know, say like the late 1800s, early 1900s, you can use nitric acid on the stick and make it look dark brown and older. And I used to do that in the beginning of my career, but I don't anymore. And nobody really does that in bow making now. You use the natural color. And you can stick the bow with varnish on it. You can stick it in a light box with UV light bulbs and it does darken. Or you can just hang it in the window for a few weeks and it darkens on its own.
Have you used a substitute for horsehair?
No, never. No.
No. Great. I think that is all of our questions for this evening.
Okay. There are some synthetic hairs, and they're usually put on very inexpensive bows so that because they don't break very easily. But I find, you know, the sound of good horsehair with good rosin is much better than any of those synthetics.
Susan, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It was an absolute pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you. My pleasure too. Thank you. Thanks to everybody who's listening, who I can't see, but thank you for listening.
Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Bye.